right, our big story that we're tracking this evening. Israel and Hamas have agreed to a temporary ceasefire, opening a path to end the 15-month-long intense fighting in the Gaza region that has killed thousands of Palestinians. The agreement, which the Israeli cabinet is yet to approve, is set to take effect on Sunday and see the phased release of 33 Israeli hostages as well as Palestinian prisoners, while Israel will pull out its troops from the densely populated areas in Gaza. US President Joe Biden took credit for the months-long negotiations, but analysts also pointed to the incoming Trump administration's efforts to pressure Israel into the deal. This report examines and explains the entire detail of what really went behind the ceasefire that has finally come into being. Take a look.
More than 15 months of carnage, destruction and deaths. This vicious cycle is expected to come to a stop when the Israel-Hamas ceasefire agreement comes into effect on Sunday. After months of stalemate in negotiations, the big announcement was made on Thursday.
دولة قطر وجمهورية مصر العربية والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية الإعلان عن نجاح جهود الوساطة المشتركة بوصول طرفي النزاع في قطاع غزة إلى اتفاق بشأن تبادل الأسرى والرهائن والعودة إلى الهدوء المستدام وصولا لوقف دائم لإطلاق النار بين الجانبين.
I knew this deal would have to be implemented by the next team, so I told my team to coordinate closely with the incoming team to make sure we're all speaking with the same voice, because that's what American presidents do.
The ceasefire and hostages deal is split into 3 phases. The first will last 42 days and see the release of 33 hostages and about 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. Residents of North Gaza will start returning during this phase. In the second phase, all Israeli male hostages will be released and all IDF forces will be withdrawn from the enclave. The third phase would include the beginning of the reconstruction of Gaza and the exchange of bodies of deceased hostages and prisoners. While Gazans flocked to the streets in celebration, there were anxious faces on the Israeli side as people waited for their loved ones to be set free by Hamas. However, there was no let-up in the war on the ground in Gaza, as Israel intensified its strikes, resulting in the deaths of dozens of Gazans. After more than 46,000 deaths in Gaza and about 1,700 across the border, the most brutal conflict in West Asia seems to be finally coming to a close. Netanyahu claims certain roadblocks remain for the deal's complete execution. The question that now lingers is how long will peace actually prevail in the region? With Vishal Vivek, Bureau Report for NDTV World.
All right, that tells you what exactly are the details and the contours of that entire ceasefire deal split into 3 phases. Let's get in our guests, but let me first start with Melissa Weiss, who is the executive editor of the Jewish Insider, joining me live from Tel Aviv. Melissa, good to have you on the show. Talk to us about what really happened behind the scenes, because it seems a similar proposition was offered about 6 months back. It was unpalatable then to the Prime Minister, but he seems to have accepted now. Talk to us about the implications of this and also what went behind the scenes.
Sure. Well, just to clarify, there is not a deal yet. Israel has not said that it has accepted a deal. We have had other parties say that they've accepted it, but here in Israel, it is not a done deal until the Prime Minister says it is a done deal. And it is our understanding, based on what we are hearing from senior security officials, that there still remain some gaps in the agreement, specifically over which prisoners, which Palestinian prisoners inside of Israel will be released. And that's where we are now. And I would just like to go back to what you just asked. There was a deal on the table in May, but Israel accepted that deal. And I think if you look at the interviews that Secretary of State Tony Blinken has given in his final days in office, what President Joe Biden has said in his final days in office, the deal that was on the table in May was a deal that Israel and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreed to. It was Hamas that walked away from those negotiations. And you even had Secretary of State Blinken saying just a few weeks ago in an interview with the New York Times that any time that Hamas perceived there to be daylight between the U.S. and Israel, that was when it was confident in walking away from the negotiating table. So I think what you saw in the spring was some daylight between the U.S. and Israel, in part over negotiations, but in part over arms sales. And Hamas took that, held on to it, and used it to its advantage to walk away from the negotiating table. Now, of course, the deal that we're seeing now is very similar to that deal in May. And when you look at the situation now versus 8 or 9 months ago, what you see is Hamas in a much weaker position, which is why they were forced back to the negotiating table and really pushed into making a deal. You know, think about where we were in May 2024. Yahya Sinwar was still alive. Mohammed Daif was still alive. Ismail Haniyeh was still alive. Hezbollah was still running free in Lebanon. The Assad regime was still in place in Syria. All of these things have changed.
Absolutely.
In this amount of
that entire region now has been completely changed. And I think that's the larger implication of what really this war has achieved, whether it is about Syria, whether it's about Lebanon, whether it's about Iran itself. Those are the larger changes that the Middle East region as a whole has changed. Before I get in some of the other guests, Melissa, I want to ask you, you're right about the fact that it's not yet ratified, so it's not a deal till it's actually announced. But what's the mood like? Are the people willing to accept this? Because there are still several quarters who feel that this is not really favorable to Israel. But what does it look like on ground?
It's a great question. Now, there was actually a survey taken about a week ago by the Israel Democracy Institute, which regularly polls on Israeli attitudes. And they found that 58% of Israelis support the deal that is on the table. So you can see in Israel overwhelming support for this deal. A majority of the country supports entering into this hostage release and ceasefire agreement. Now, whether or not that's enough to get it over the finish line remains to be seen. But the mood here is hopeful, it is apprehensive. We will see what happens.
Indeed, let's see what really happens as far as whether or not there is actually a deal on the table or not. There are positive signs because there are external factors as well. And we're going to talk about all of that. And Melissa, stay with us because we're slipping into a very short break. We come back on the other side and talk more about the implications. Is this really a stepping stone to lasting peace? Or is this now going to be more of a stopgap arrangement before things actually unravel? We talk on that and more. Stay with us. We come back with this story. Welcome back. You're watching our special edition of India Global, where we are asking the question, how long will peace actually last in the ceasefire that is yet to be ratified, and is hoping that this could pave the way for peace to actually happen. Okay, let's get in Melissa, who's joining us from Tel Aviv. Melissa, before slipping into a break, we had that breaking news that's coming in that Israel has actually delayed cabinet vote on Gaza ceasefire hostage deal, saying that Hamas has actually gone back on parts of the agreement. Before we get into this back and forth, the question I want to ask you is this reflective of the lack of trust when it comes to the two sides? And will that make the chances of ceasefire and lasting peace that much tougher?
Well, let's not pretend that there is any trust between Israel and Hamas now or ever. The trust is on the negotiators and the middlemen and the parties who are involved, the U.S., Egypt, Qatar. The hope is that they will, certainly Egypt and Qatar, keep Hamas in compliance with the agreement. Remember, senior Hamas officials live in Qatar and Turkey. So both of those countries have enormous sway over what the top echelons of the terror group do. So there is no trust between the groups, but I don't think that's the cause for what is going on right now. It sounds like Hamas has, in the words of the Israeli Prime Minister, reneged, gone back on one core part of the agreement, which is oversight over which released prisoners who have committed serious crimes against Israelis will be released in the agreement. And that's an understandable thing, because when you look at Israel's history with releasing prisoners, There's the most high-profile case. Alam Tamimi was released. She was responsible for the Sbarro bombing during the Second Intifada that killed more than a dozen Israelis.
Indeed.
And she's now living in Jordan, where she is a TV show host. And that is because she was released in a deal. And so there's concern that the people that are released in the coming days, should a deal go through.
That is a very legit and a real fear and threat that Israel and the Israeli government will have to try and overcome, because that is what really looks like as the best case scenario in terms of the deal that is on the table. Thanks much, Melissa. Really appreciate you joining me from Tel Aviv on a story which has two angles, a story which has two sides. And I'm going to make sure that I'm going to keep telling our viewers the two sides of this. We're going to get our guest this evening, Hasan T AlHasan, who's joining me from Bahrain, Dr. Waiel Awwad, who's in India. He's a Syrian, both of whom have said that they don't want to be with a person from Israel joining in, but that defeats the purpose of a discussion, because as I said, this is a ceasefire between two parties. If the two parties are not able to have a TV discussion together, then what are we really looking at in terms of a possible deal? James Bowden joins me as well from the US. And James, let me ask you this first question. The fact that we are at a situation where there is such deep mistrust between the parties, are we really looking at a peace that could last longer than the 42 days of the first phase?
No, and I really have not had any optimism about this deal going through and being fully approved. So I was laying heavy emphasis last night on the fact that the deal had not even been voted on in the cabinet. And unfortunately, when I woke up this morning and saw the headlines that there had been a delay and that there was a lot of mistrust, I was like, here we go again. You know, this is why I have generally not even talked much about any peace deals or even ceasefires, because they do typically break down. And I would like to place emphasis on the role that the Netanyahu government is in backing out of these possible ceasefires. You know, we have to also look at the players in the Israeli government who refuse to make any ceasefire a possibility. They have constantly delayed, constantly offered excuse after excuse not to get into a ceasefire. And I believe that that is largely and primarily based on the fact that they want this war to continue. And they don't want the ceasefire. And so they're looking for even the merest little excuse in order to back out and say, well, we tried. And, you know, now we have to go back to war.
Indeed, it's a very precarious situation. And let's get in Mr. AlHasan from Bahrain. Sir, your first, the first thing I want to ask you is that at this stage, it is yet to be, the ceasefire deal is yet to be ratified by Israeli cabinet. But there are some reports that seem to indicate that Hamas has already gone back on what it had committed on the negotiating table. What are the prospects of this deal from that point of view in the climate of mistrust, in the climate of such deep mistrust between the two sides?
So to begin with, before I answer your question, just for the record, I've made no refusal whatsoever not to appear with any person from any nationality. That hasn't happened. Beyond that, and to answer your question more directly, I think it's these are Israeli allegations at the moment. We don't have independent, nonpartisan confirmation from any of the three mediators, be it the United States, Egypt, or Qatar, that Hamas has gone back on any part of the deal. We don't have, as far as I know, an independent confirmation from Hamas saying that they've gone back on any part of this deal. So this is an Israeli allegation. It has to be treated as an Israeli allegation unless and until it is verified by Hamas sources or by any of the independent three mediators. Now, beyond that, it's obvious that we also need to be aware of some of these narratives. The Biden administration has fed us for over a year the false narrative, and I've heard it firsthand from senior Biden administration officials, that there is simply no deal conceivable, feasible, that Hamas would agree to, and that it would simply be impossible to get Israel to budge on the idea of a full withdrawal. The assumption that the Israelis would simply not leave or would not agree to leave the Netzarim corridor or Philadelphia corridor. Both of these have now been proven to be absolutely false. There is a deal that, as far as we know, Hamas has accepted, and with the necessary pressure that the Trump administration has been willing to exert on Israel, Israel has budged on and went back to this idea of a full withdrawal from Gaza.
Dr. Awwad, is this temporary truce, or could this actually pave the way for lasting peace in the region?
Gaurie, let me put it straightforward. I think it is President Trump who have the credit of forcing Netanyahu to sign a deal which has been on the table since May of last year, because Biden himself repeatedly said in his last speech that 3 times he's mentioned that the deal was already on the table, but it was Netanyahu, in fact, who was refused even to acknowledge or sign the deal because of the pressure from his internal government and his coalition parties who refused to reach to such a deal. Even Smotrich, till this moment, he is refusing, and he is putting condition to Netanyahu that if you wanted to go for this deal, only go for the first phase of the deal, which have the release of the 33 prisoners who are alive from the Israeli side, with Hamas, and then we will go back and attack Hamas and achieve our objective of eliminating Hamas from there, achieving victories, and then we will release the rest of the hostages. So if that is the case, then I think what we are hearing, yes, is a mistrust is happening there, but there are guarantors who are providing this deal to be implemented on the table. First is the American administration. Second is the Arab capitals who've been participating in this negotiation.
Okay, Mr. Bowden, then let me ask you this question. And, we are playing those big questions graphics as well for our viewers to understand the contours of this discussion. Which the second part, which is equally important, is that will Israeli Prime Minister be able to garner the support from his right-wing members in the coalition to be able to push through this, because there are also deep discontentment in Israel with regard to a deal which looks very one-sided and favoring Hamas and being unfair to Israel. There are many sections who feel that way.
Right. I don't see Netanyahu being able to get the rest of his government behind him. Let's remember that in 2023, Smotrich and Ored Stroke came out in an article and talked about how horrible the 2005-2006 Gaza disengagement was, and how they wanted to go back into Gaza and finish the job of cleaning out the Palestinians and reoccupying it. And they lamented the lack of political will that they had for that. Now, that was July of 2023. Then all of a sudden, we have this very convenient war in October of 2023. So, I mean, this is an opportunity for people who are on the cabinet to carry out a strong political program to reoccupy that area.
Okay. Mr. AlHasan, then let me ask you this, that after phase 1 is completed, how soon do you think phase 2, phase 3 can actually be executed? In your assessment, how far away are we from this entire deal being closed and for peace to actually come in?
So there are many risks and many challenges that could potentially threaten the successful implementation of this deal. To take a close and nearby analogy to the Gaza case, the Lebanon case, a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel has been in place since at least November. And according to the Lebanese government, there have been at least 470 Israeli violations since November of that ceasefire deal. And so I think the temptation for Israel to potentially violate a ceasefire agreement will very much be on the table, especially if the extremist right-wing members of Netanyahu's coalition and government apply enough pressure on Israel to do so. But I think beyond this immediate risk of ceasefire violations, I think the big picture is that for us to see a so-called lasting peace on the short to medium term, that will depend on very largely on the US's ability to restrain Israel partly from committing violations, but also from potentially precipitating another confrontation with Iran. There are many in Israel and even in the United States who think that now is the right time to strike Iran's nuclear program. That would be an extremely dangerous and risky course of action. So part of this will depend on whether the Americans can restrain the Israelis from taking high-risk action against Iran, and whether the Americans can deter the Iranians from trying to reconstitute their regional network of armed proxy groups.
Indeed.
Now, beyond the short to medium term, I think the long-term success of this peace will depend on the Trump administration's ability to broker successfully, working with Arab and other non-Arab partners, a long-term agreement and a long-term peace plan with the Palestinians and the Israelis as well.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I'm completely out of time, but thank you so much for joining me in this discussion. And Mr. AlHasan, thank you for clarifying that you would like to join with any nationality. Look forward to having you again on my show next week with an expert from Israel to really talk in detail about what happens from here on. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking out the time today.